Why did you bring him?
Because he's our house guest, Ellis. Can't just leave him at the house by himself.
What are you gonna put on, Chad? Phil Collins?
Oh.
I got green and I got blues, and every day there's a little less difference between the two. I belly up and disappear. Well, I ain't really drowning 'cause I see the beach from here. And I could take a Greyhound home. When I got there, it'd be gone along with everything a home is made up of. So I'll take two what you're having. I'll take all of what you got to kill this goddamn lonely, goddamn lonely love.
You never gave me a gift.
Randy, that's enough.
Sister, listen to what your daddy says. Don't be ashamed of things that hide behind your dress.
Wendy, stop it.
Belly up and arch your back. Well,
You took a foot off me! Get off me! Get off me!
and you could come to me by plane, but that wouldn't be the same as that old motel room in Texarkana West. So I'll take two.
I don't want to be touched.
I'll take all of what you
Wendy.
got.
You're gone.
Kill this
Go home.
goddamn lonely love.
Sorry, I was muted there. Hello, everyone. My name is Randy, and I'm here to talk with you about movies and making them, succeeding by making them, and sometimes failing by making them. And that first clip was from my second feature I directed called Among Ravens with Amy Smart, Will McCormick, and Joshua Leonard. And it was the first time I had directed a movie with non-natives about non-natives. And the original title, I'm not kidding, was called Savages. And it was going to be a native filmmaker taking a look at a group of pretty unlikable non-natives in a moneyed piece of Idaho, northern Idaho, a lake community, and kind of as if I was the anthropologist. So that was a fun movie to make. We can talk more about what went wrong with that one, because that was the example of something that didn't turn out so the way I wanted it to. But we can talk about how I began. I began making films in, I'm from Texas originally. I began making films in New York City, where I moved to about 20 seconds after I graduated from high school to get out of Texas. And I found my filmmaking self in New York City. Made some short films there, went to Sundance, got some grants, did that whole thing. And back when I started, pardon the car by, in my garage. Back when I started, you still had to, there was no digital kind of easy access technology yet. So you still had to like make a short film or two, write a feature script, and then find $1 million. And that was literally how 90%, 95% of first features were made independently. So that's what I did. I made a few short films, had some success at festivals, and then I was invited to the Sundance Directors Lab in 1994, which was a really wonderful experience. I was able to work on scenes from a feature script that I wrote with amazing actors and producers, all-star producers and directors and cinematographers and editors from Hollywood. And that was a really rewarding experience. And that sort of was my film school. I didn't formally go to film school. I took a year-long workshop in New York City for people of color at a place called Third World Newsreel. And then I went to the Sundance Directors Lab, and then I just started making movies and messing things up and learning that way. I've always edited my own work up until my first feature. And then I returned to editing my own work after that. So I've edited 2 of the 3 features that I've directed, and pretty much everything else that I've ever done in fiction and documentary. The Doughboy, my first feature, went to Sundance and did really well there, won an award, and kind of put me on the map. And then it's been a long journey of bouncing back from short form to long form fiction, documentary. A few years ago, I edited a movie, or co-edited a movie called The Infiltrators, which won 2 awards at Sundance. And so these days I consider myself an editor of documentary and a writer director of fiction. I've also moved into television most recently, and I've worked on a couple of Amazon series as a writer. Well, scripts that we hope that will become series. And I'm an artist in residence currently at Concordia Studios, which is Davis Guggenheim's studio out here in California. And I'm speaking to you from my garage in Long Beach, and would love to hear from you guys. Anything you want to know, or I can just ramble on forever, which is also okay. That scene that you just saw with Amy Smart, Will McCormick, and Joshua Leonard again was from a movie called Among Ravens that I made in Idaho, co-directed with my collaborator, Russell Friedenberg. It was one of the best experiences I ever had, but it was also one of the hardest things that I could imagine doing. We made that feature in 18 days with a huge cast of about 8 or 9, with kids, horses, water, boats, fire, and huge company moves. And, we did basically everything you're not supposed to do if you want to do something fast. I think the common wisdom is if you're going to shoot something quickly, you put it in a house and shoot it in one location with just a handful of people in the cast. Horror movies are famous for that technique, and it does work. So we bucked that trend and made a film, and we shot in a live 4th of July parade too. We just inserted ourselves into this live parade with the camera, and we got a really great scene that way. But that was a really arduous thing to do. And I learned an awful lot about directing with somebody else, the need to be efficient, how you can achieve something that seems impossible in its scale and its scope, given your resources, and just what that requires of the team in terms of synchronicity and goodwill and collaboration. But that film, I think the reason it wasn't as successful as some of the other ones in terms of it, the response to it was because the script was written a little faster than we would like. And there's a long story behind that, but I think the lesson there is that everything depends on the script of the story, and just how sound it is. And, it's really the architecture of everything you're going to build, which changes all the time. But I always think of that, I think it was John Coltrane that said, you practice scales every day, or even one note every day, so that you can improvise, so that you have the foundation to improvise. And so the script I still think of a really, really good script as the scale to the music you're going to play on set, and then again in the editing room, where things can change and be reimagined and reshaped. And so that's another reason that, in addition to loving writing and directing and working on a grand scale for a short period of time, I still also really love putting it all together in the editing room. So I spend a lot of time doing that. Currently, I'm cutting a documentary for HBO in my garage. And I just finished a documentary that we submitted to TIFF. And it's called Being Michelle, about a neurodivergent woman who's caught in the prison system who has been caught in the prison system since she's been very young, and hopes to kind of find her way and not go back. So very rewarding to move from genre to genre, from fiction to documentary, from short form to long form. Here's an interesting piece of trivia. I edited Johnny Depp's wedding video, which was a trip. And so I've done a lot of really strange things. I've done a lot of work in Canada with Big Soul Productions. I don't know if you guys I'm sure you've heard of the TV series Moccasin Flats, which was shot out in Regina some years ago. And the pilot for that, which was a short film, I directed that and edited that. But then because of the rules of American directors, I didn't get to work on the series. So I did a short film called 133 Skyway with Big Soul Productions, starring the musician Derek Miller. Music videos. I've had a lot of fun and a lot of rewarding experiences working in Canada. So will always have a special place in my heart. And this film institute, Shirley's Film Institute, I taught screenwriting there some years ago. And so I'm happy to be back in this capacity. So there is a question from Miranda. Was there a certain filmmaker that sparked your interest in making movies? That's a great question. I don't think there was a filmmaker that sparked my interest in making movies, but just going to the movies. Like when I grew up, it was music and movies were the two things, and sports, the three things that I really engaged with. And that has not changed as I've gotten older. So film back when I grew up was, this is before the internet, before, cell phones, before really, amazing worlds, the digital worlds that you could disappear into. There was just nothing like going to the movies. And so that had an indelible imprint on me, as did, rock and roll. So I was inspired to make them because of the effect they had on me. And because as a young Native person in my 20s, as I was really becoming a political creature, I wanted to say things. In terms of filmmakers that inspired me once I had decided to make them, there are a few. And ironically, there were not a lot of fiction Native makers when I started to look up to. So at the time, I really looked up to Spike Lee, and I really looked up to Mike Lee, which is ironic that they have the same last name, because one is an African-American from Brooklyn and one is a British guy, and they spell it differently. But Spike, more in just his audacity to do it, and to sort of crack open this market with this kind of incendiary voice and wit. And then Mike Lee, just in the way that he is a cinematic painter and the way that he works with characters. His process isn't one that I've been able to enjoy as a director, because he rehearses for months and months and months with his actors before, just around a theme. He doesn't really have a script, but he ends up with one out of all these really intense months-long rehearsals. So I thought that was an amazing process to discover the characters and the story through that rehearsal process, and then move on to the script. So Mike Lee, check him out. I know you know Spike, but those two makers. And this is so weird. Ang Lee is another one of my favorite. So they're all named Lee for some reason. So Ang Lee, who did the Ice Storm, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Brokeback Mountain. He's another filmmaker that I really, really admire and was inspired by just the poetry that he brings to the table and the diversity of subject matter that he engages with. Rachel says, what would you recommend to new and emerging filmmakers who want to learn to write their first feature screenplay? That's an awesome question. And I think many years ago, somebody might have said, go to school. I think you should watch movies, good and bad, and read screenplays, which are, easily accessible on the internet now. You can find at least some version of the screenplay for any movie that you probably love. I do this, and I love, as an editor and a director and a writer, I love to watch a movie and then read the screenplay and see how it's changed. And one of them that I've done that to, just as a way of illustrating this, is Django Unchained. I watched that movie over and over and over, and then I read the script, and even though that movie is very long, the script was even longer. And it's nice to see what they took out and try to imagine why they did it. And I can give you an example of something they took out. So Sam Jackson's character was the house guy. He was the right-hand man of Leonardo DiCaprio, the master. And he was a very powerful character. And he needed to meet Django eye to eye, and nobody blinked. If you notice that Sam Jackson, if you've seen the movie, at the very last scene, 2 seconds before he died and he was being shot full of bullet holes by Django, he still had his power. He was still saying, cursing Django out. If you read the script, very early on after they meet, Django kind of alphas Sam Jackson's character and kind of shows him who's boss. And when I read that, I could see in 2 seconds why Quentin Tarantino would edit that out of the movie, because you can't have Django taking Sam Jackson's power away, because he's a surrogate for the power of the master, and you would have lost tons of tension. So that's a value of getting into some sort of a rhythm between watching films that you love and reading the screenplay, and also doing them separately. Like, just read great screenplays, get your hands on screenplays that are good, that were never made, get your hands on screenplays. Everybody's got 10 screenplays, and if you're lucky, if you get to make 2 of them. But I have written a lot of stuff, and most of it, you always write more as a screenwriter than you'll make or will get made. So read screenplays, watch movies, and there's master classes from just these giant legendary writers. So it's not all about film school anymore. You can learn a lot reading, listening to podcasts, master classes, and just writing. Nobody can stop you from doing it. In the world we live in now, all of those resources are out there, with or without film school. So, great question. Again, a note about screenwriting. I've done a lot of different things. I've, worked for hire, collaborated with a close friend for many years, given script notes, worked as a consultant, but I'm most comfortable writing from my heart about things that I know. The Doughboy, my first feature, was pretty autobiographical story about my father and our first deer hunt, and my mother, and just the complicated identity of having a Native mom and a white dad. So that was right from my heart. I've also, Among Ravens, it was more of a kind of outside looking in, and other things that I feel like I'm at my best when it's something that I know, which is kind of a cliche to write what you know, but it doesn't mean it's a biography. It just means it's a world that you know the vocabulary of, that you know the ins and outs of culturally, the texture of it, the way people talk, the relationships. And once you do know that, it's easier to get characters to act in a world. Everyone has an amazing story. And now's a great time to be a native maker too, because they're actually listening finally. Here's a question. What kind of advice do you give an Indigenous person working within the arts? Well, I don't know if I could speak on the arts in general, but that's a great segue, because I again, when I started, although I did have some interest in the early 90s, like from Sundance, I had some incredible support. It was still like the space didn't exist. We were, with the help of the Sundance Institute and Robert Redford and Michelle Satter, Heather Ray, Bird Running Water, and the Smithsonian also, in my own experience, Elizabeth Weatherford and her group, they were really, supporting the films once we made them and combing the globe to find makers. And I was one of the first ones with Shirley Chichu and Chris Eyre, Shelley Nero, small group of us that were doing fiction in Canada and North America. And the space is much more populated now. Not just because we maybe cracked that open, but because the technology became accessible and you didn't have to, be rich to buy cameras. When it was all on film, it was a very formidable economic thing to do, because film was very expensive to process and buy, and the cameras you had to rent, it was very hard to own them. But now, there's been such a revolution in access to the tools of the trade that no one can stop you. And it is a good time to tell your story because they are listening now, at least down here. I mean, they've, listened here and there to certain makers, but they're listening on a grand scale right now. And there are a lot of people that I know that have been at this for a while. They're doing really well right now in film and television, as directors, writers, and producers, and they're looking for these voices. And I don't know if it's going to last forever, but it's a great, exciting time to get your voice out there 100%. And to work with a community, hook up with other makers that are in it too. It's really important to have that community of peers and friends and mentors too, that kind of all engage in this exciting moment. My friends just walked by. Anyways, that's a great question. In terms of the arts in general, I can't really speak about fine art as much, but I just, when I started, it was kind of an act of will. There was just something that it wasn't like society told you it was possible. You had to believe it was possible. But I think, there's so many talented native makers, and, even, from like Danis's film. I mean, there's people from Canada and the US that are just out there kicking ass, and there's no reason to believe it can't be you. So I think it's just know that it's possible and tell your story. It's a quiet group. I'll tell you an anecdote that's kind of connected to that first scene. We got really bad reviews for that movie. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because I think it's fun to talk about successes, but sometimes you learn, even more profound lessons from the ones that maybe weren't as successful. So that movie, 100 was 100% fun to make, has beautiful, beautiful moments in it that I'm very proud of. And I know the whole team is. And, but we had this character that was an overwhelmed kind of businessman. He wasn't eccentric or, particularly special. He's just a father who, kind of had some money problems that he was keeping from his wife, and things were falling apart. And he was trying to keep up appearances over a 4th of July weekend because her ex-husband and some other friends were coming, and he wasn't going to reveal the truth during that because it would have embarrassed everybody, his wife and himself. And he was just a guy, and he kind of wasn't eccentric. He wasn't extroverted necessarily. He's just a supportive, hardworking guy that was in a lot of trouble. But the actor, when we went to wardrobe with the actor and we dressed him in what we thought the character would wear, which was something pretty subtle and that didn't draw a lot of attention to himself. And we were like, okay, cool. So when it came time to shoot his first scene, he showed up in short swimming trunks with sailboats on them, a pink blazer, and like this straw, like Gilligan's Island hat, and an ascot. And we were so far out in the woods, and we didn't really know. We were barely making our days, so we just kind of went with it, and it ended up really ruining the tone of that character. So what I've learned from talking to some people I respect after telling that story was, even if you don't think you have the money to stop production for an hour, and you don't think that, maybe you don't want the confrontation, or maybe you don't have the badass producer that can get in his face, and you can't threaten to fire him because you're so far out in the middle of nowhere, you still owe it to your movie to not let that happen. And that's a really hard, one of the most profound lessons that I've learned as a director. You have to stay honest to your story. And if you perceive something that's just not honest, doesn't have the integrity of the story, a choice, even your own, you have to cast it out or challenge it. So a couple of questions. Adam, how politics played a role in your filmmaking? In my early work, it was very political. I was exploring my anger at certain things as a Native person, things that I perceived were taken from my family, and the people, and also just really had an intense relationship with my dad, who is, again, was white, and just that complicated nature of that identity kind of crisis mixed with young man's just anger at history and things that happened when I grew up. So they were very political movies. My work is probably even more political now, because I've edited and worked on a lot of activist documentary. And I've also, I don't know if anyone's heard of this, but the Style Horse Collective, we did this viral video called We Shall Remain that went viral, and this series called Powwow Sweat. And, so we spent a lot of time in activist work on reservations as the Style Horse Collective, and it was 4 of us, and we did it anonymously. We just called ourselves a collective. So I've always stayed political in my work, and as a documentary editor, and as a kind of an activist on reservations, as a teacher, and as an advocate. So it's got, in some ways, it's less personally political. Like I don't want to stay in those original state of mind when I was 25. I'm a different person now, but overall, my work has become more political, and I think that's important, even if you don't call it that. It is very important to speak up and out about things. And with activist documentary, it's also nice to take a break from them sometimes, because they take a lot out of you. Yeah, very political. If someone has a screenplay finished, how do you get about networking and finding a producer? That's a very good question. I can't really speak on how it happens in Canada, but I have to rewind. It's not always easy to do that, but there are, whoever, if you know anybody in the community. I don't know what the resources are in Canada, but in my experience, it was just a lot of networking, a lot of asking questions, a lot of, now you can get online and find out what the resources are for young makers. And just, trying to get it into the hands of someone that can read it. It's just not to be afraid to have those conversations. And one thing I've learned, don't be afraid to ask, and don't be afraid to be annoying. Ask more than once, reach out. Editing, you said you hired an editor for a film once, but returned to editing your most recent film. Do you find both directing and editing a film a challenge? I absolutely do. That's a great question, Rachel. And I've learned a pretty powerful lesson about doing both. And I don't know that I'll do both again, because 2 of the 3 features I directed and edited. And there's something great about it as well. But when I co-directed Among Ravens, I was the editor. And even though I had co-directed it, when I was sitting in the editing room with my collaborator, Russell Friedenberg, who's also a dear friend, suddenly I was the editor, even though we were both directors. Just being in that chair, you know, you do all the technical work, tedious work too sometimes. And then somebody has an idea, and even if it is a good idea, you filter it through the fact that you have to do the chore of implementing it sometimes. So I found myself like at times arguing against a good idea because I knew I had to actually undo something that we had just built. And then when I moved back as a director, you just say it, and that's the editor's problem. So I realized that's probably a reason not to do it, is because that objectivity becomes braided with the chore of editing and sometimes muddles your vision. So it is a challenge, and it's probably not something I'll do again, because as a director, if you have a really good editor, you can affect the edit, you know, profoundly, but also objectively when you're collaborating. What do you think is the most important quality of a film director? That's a really, if I had to reduce it to one quality, I'll say, let me parachute into that question. If you're on film set and you're a director, there's a myth that you have to know everybody's job. Like, you know, you're collaborating with other artists, and, you know, if people tell you you need to know how to do all those jobs, it just isn't true. You're collaborating with other artists. You need to be able to communicate your vision, and you need to be able to answer the question, what's next? So I guess the most important quality would be to be really well prepared to answer the question, what's next? Because once you're on set, things move really fast. And if you're working on something of any scale, you as a director are synthesizing all the energies and all the talents of everyone collaborating with you in the interest of your vision for this. And it doesn't mean you're a dictator. It just means you're the one that people need information from. And it's better to just say, give me a minute, but be prepared to answer the question, what's next? And so I would guess being a good listener and somebody who really prepares for every day and accept input from your cinematographer, from your production designer, because they're artists, and to not direct, to be secure in what you're bringing and accept other ideas. Maybe that's not the most important quality, but I think it's just being, if I had to reduce all of that, it's being a great collaborator with a strong vision. So there's strength in the way you see it and an absolute willingness to listen to other people. Just don't be an insecure, don't be, you know, there's a lot of assholes doing this too. Don't be one of those people. How do you deal or manage with unprofessionalism on set with actors? Shirley, I got into that with Among Ravens. I don't know if you're here, but I had an actor who changed his wardrobe from what we had dressed him as, and it completely changed the tone of not only his character, but of the entire movie. And we weren't, at the time, as co-directors, and we had such an overwhelmed staff that the perception was we didn't have the resources. We didn't have the resources to fire him for sure, and we didn't have the resources to get in his face and tell him to go get. We just thought we didn't have the resources for that fight. So that's an example of how I didn't deal with it. And he was empowered from that point. It was very difficult to wrangle the tone of that character. It changed the recipe. It recalibrated the tonality of the entire movie, not for the better. So you owe it to your movie to deal with it. Absolutely. Because it's, you know, and you know, you're on a movie, you're barely making your day, you're running out of money, you don't have time to fire anybody, you're out in the middle of nowhere. There's all the million reasons not to deal with it, but you as a maker have to live with it. And it's much better to deal with it. Hollywood's full of jackass actors who hold films hostage because of their power. And I just have zero interest in that. And I think if someone's being unprofessional, hopefully you have a strong producer or a strong AD who can set them straight. But if it has to be you, you have to have the conversation, because you cannot empower a bully in any context, much less a creative one where time is money. But I haven't had a lot of that, and I actually loved that actor and we overall enjoyed it. I don't think I understood just how much his choice and my choice to not challenge his choice to dress like a cartoon character. I don't think I understood what that meant in terms of the integrity of the movie. Very, very profound lesson that I learned. And that's why I like to tell that story. So that's a great question. Is that Shirley, or a different Shirley? Shirley Chi-Chi Shirley? Yay, hi Shirley. From Patty. Do you recommend young emerging filmmakers to stay in their local community or move to LA, New York, Toronto? That's such a good, these questions are so good. One of the things that I think that I value most as a storyteller is a regional or a very culturally specific voice. So you take someone like Sterling Harjo, who is kicking holy butt all over, now all over what you could call Hollywood, because he's got a show on FX. It's just got, it's probably going to go for multiple seasons. But he never left where he's from. I mean, he went an hour away maybe to Tulsa, but he's still telling stories from the heart center of his experience. And the entire world opened up to him from that place. So that's one example. There's somebody like me who grew up in an Air Force base and moved around and had a complicated identity already. I'm a little bit of a different animal. I'm more of a nomad. I still haven't had any interest in Hollywood, even though I live in Long Beach. I've always just kind of done my thing. But it just depends on what your goals are. It's perfectly reasonable, Patty, if your goal is to direct, a superhero movie, then, that's probably LA or New York. I don't know. I can't speak much on Toronto, but it just depends on what your goals are, and one can lead to the other. You can start out in a small personal space and end up doing something on a grand scale as well. One of my favorite movies is The Rider. I don't know if you saw it. Her second film, Zoe's second film, or Chloe, sorry, I keep confusing her. Her second film won the Best Picture this year, Nomadland, and then she's in the Marvel universe now. I find something sad about that, because her films are so intimate and, just beautiful and quiet in ways, really emotional, towering stories on not this epic scale. But eventually, does Marvel have to chew up everybody? In my opinion, it doesn't. But you could also take that trajectory where you start out telling your really, really, personal, regionally based, culturally centered stories, and they could take you anywhere you want. But I still find that to be the most important thing there is. And I think it's important, some people want to sell that to Marvel, and some people want to keep telling their stories. So it just depends on what your goals are, but you absolutely do not have to move to LA, New York, or Toronto. And I don't recommend it unless you have that ambition. Great questions, you guys. So, okay. Oh, those are some things. These are the American Indian Film Festival, and this is the Red Nation Film Festival. It looks like an Oscar, but it's not. It's Oscar the Grouch. This is my garage that I tried to make look like a living room just for this. There's paddle boards and strollers and shit in here too. Cool. Oh, I did that. I talked about Ravens. Oh, so I made this movie. Here's another experience I had. Sometimes in LA and New York, they want you to be one thing. So if you're a director and you edit, or if you're a DP and you write, they can't always process that. I'll give you two examples of where my directing and editing worlds collided. I was pitching a feature, a narrative feature to Vice, and they had rescheduled the appointment. And so I think one or two times. And I finally got in there and I was excited and I had this pitch worked out, memorized it, a bunch of stuff. So I show up at Vice and just about to pitch, and they're like, "We're sorry that we had to reschedule, but we had to watch this movie we really had to watch this movie called The Infiltrators." And I'm like, Infiltrators is a documentary that just won at Sundance. I'm there pitching a feature fiction, and I said, "Yeah, I edited that." Now you would think maybe that would be interesting to them, but it really kind of drained life from the room, because now they have to deal with considering me as two things. What's this editor of, immigrant documentary doing here as a director pitching this fiction? So that's a place where it didn't really work to be two people. The third feature I directed, Edge of the World, I was originally the editor, and this bears on Shirley's question about sticking to the script really well, so bear with me. I did not want to do this movie. It was a low budget feature, but a really dear friend of mine, native guy, Gilbert Salas, was the DP, and he was like, "Please edit it, just please edit it. I don't know how this is going to turn out." And so I read the script, hated it, met with the director, didn't jive with her, just didn't want to do it. So I said, "No, don't want to do it. No, no, no." A few months went by and I had my son, and the director came back and said, I have to have you, and I'll pay you this, and your wife can be the assistant editor. And I just had a kid and hadn't kind of been worked in a while. So I'm like, I'm going to do this one more crazy job, then I'm not going to do it. Well, 4 days into shooting, I replaced her as the director because she was in way over her head and they were really liking my script notes. So I ended up flying to West Texas for this movie that I'd been shooting for 5 days at that point. And the first day I got there was a scene with 60 extras, a big bus of cross-country runners, and they had this hero's welcome on this boys ranch in West Texas. And I just threw the script out. I knew the script. I just shot every day without a script. The actors didn't have a script. The line producer couldn't schedule the day. It was the most stressful but freeing kind of thing. And I reshot 95% of what she had shot. And that movie, that's probably the best job I ever did on anything. And no one really saw it. It's a small movie called Edge of the World. It's about to be back online. And it's probably the best job I ever did because of the stakes, just the sheer size of the cast, and because of the problems with the script that I corrected. Just every day I would just go, okay, what do the characters need to do next? And it has no reason to be any good, and it is a really good little movie. So that's a perfect example of reason not to stick to the script. It's an unusual example. There are times where my editor self, when I'm directing, really helps me economize things. So I perceive something that maybe we don't need to shoot this scene because it's, for whatever reason, I'll think of it. And it's also sometimes thinking that way gets me into trouble because you don't want to start editing the movie in your head and being certain that you don't need something, because you might need something. So, but there are times where you get a really great idea on set. And dialogue's an easy one. There are certain lines that I really like, but a really good actor can usually find the honesty in a line. And if a line isn't resonating as honesty with as honest to the way the character would talk or what the moment would need, I could care less about that. But I don't always stick to the script. But it's still the script. I don't recommend working the way I did on Edge of the World, where there basically isn't one. That was a harrowing but rewarding experience. But no, sometimes you lose scenes, sometimes you add scenes, all sorts of stuff happens. Sometimes you get rained out and you got to figure out how to combine two scenes because you got one day left. There's all sorts of reasons to be flexible in the way you tell the story. And then there are things to absolutely fight for. And I think experience teaches you where to pick your fights and when you can let go of something. And these are hard lessons. And a lot of the ones I learned, with really high stakes. So great question. Thank you. I would just like to say that these were really great questions. And I was happy to be here. My next feature is called Horse Thief. And I'm super excited about that. I'm also have all my fingers and toes crossed for a TV series that looks like it could happen at Amazon, that I would be in the writing room with, and was in the writing room for the first 2 episodes. One more question. Rachel says, have you had challenges with balancing art and commercial success? That's such a good question. I'll be 55 in October. I've always made some kind of I've just completely committed to this as what I do. There have been times where I was like, this is a little bit personal, but I've laid in the bathtub freaking out because I was 3 months behind rent, with heart palpitations. And I've also, on Edge of the World, when they wanted me to replace the director and I was already the editor, I said, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. So I said to my wife, I'm going to quote them something ridiculous. Like I'm going to quote them a weekly rate that sounds ridiculous. And I did. And they said yes. So that was a profound lesson, just to ask for not only what you're worth, but sometimes more than you're worth. But it is very difficult, not just with directing, with editing. So there's again, the editing is my bread and butter. I have a pretty good reputation there. I'm reasonably sure that the phone is going to ring. I don't try to get jobs usually. Directing is a different thing because I'd like it to flow from my writing, which takes time, and I haven't done as much as I should have with that. But it was well into my career before I had any financial stability, and it's really only in the last few years, to be honest with you. I don't think you have to be a starving artist. I think there's ways now to market and create economies because of the digital world around what you do. And when I started, there was a real separation, a real stigma about video and about commercials. Like the last thing you would ever do if you were an independent filmmaker with any kind of integrity and any kind of political voice would be, working on a car commercial, which I still wouldn't do, but just those worlds have all kind of blended together. And you can do branded content, you can do create your own channel. There's a lot of ways to monetize it if you get some business training, which I suck at still to this day. And I hate being on Instagram, taking a picture of myself. Like I don't like all that. So I've had a hard time, but finally, just from being around so long and doing so much and meeting so many people, I feel like I have finally achieved some sort of stability. Shirley says, how do you deal with executives when they don't understand about Indigenous content? You find yourself compromising in order to make the film. I'm going through that right now, Shirley. And again, in a time where I think executives are more open to the idea of Indigenous content. But currently, I don't know if I'm much I can talk about this, but it's tricky because this is my personal opinion. I won't use my personal story, but I'll use my personal my opinion, a strong opinion. This Dark Wind series that's coming out, that somebody I absolutely admire and love, who has been in my corner, was in my corner in my early years and means the world to me and always will. Robert Redford is executive producing it, I think. And I think Chris is directing the pilot, but I have huge problems with Tony Hillerman. So if I found myself in, not that I think I will or expect to, but if I found myself in the position to direct that material, I would have a conversation about the way that it's constructed, the sort of colonial way that it's constructed, that would be probably not get me the job. So it's just kind of like, how do you balance all this? I think these two questions can be married. If you think, okay, I got kids, I've got bills, this job pays well, but it's completely, destructive in the way that it isn't, like maybe on the surface, but when you study the way it's put together, it's not so good. It's not so good for indigenous, people. Tony Hillerman was writing basically detective fiction, which was always designed to protect the status quo. So it's the kind of the native version of Mike Hammer or something. So I think those questions are hard, like sticking to your guns and to what you believe, balancing that with sometimes you got to get the job, but again, you have to live with it. So what can you as a maker live with on your resume? How precious. I've had films I've done things that were completely off the brand that I thought was my brand. Like I started out writing, directing, and I veered all over the place. And it's been interesting looking back on it. It's very rewarding, but there's still that special place that I protect. So for me, I turn myself into a bunch of different people: the editor, the teacher, TV writer, and the director for hire, and the writer director. So I just diversified the way I did it as a way to protect some piece of it. I don't know if that made sense, but it is something you're going to bump into over and over. Working on an HBO, even as an editor, sometimes when you work for a big streaming company, there's a huge team of people with thoughts. You've got to be able to take it all in, don't quarrel with the good ideas, gently quarrel with the bad ideas, and maybe refuse to implement the horrible ideas. and every situation is going to have different stakes for you. It's no easy answer. But I think you got to stay true to yourself for as long and forever, but you also have to compromise if you want to work at on a certain scale. And how big do you want your audience to be? You shouldn't sell out your principles so you can have a big audience, but you can make compromises because to reach a bigger audience. And that just might mean, I don't know what that would mean, but it would mean different things every time. Congratulations to Shirley too, and all of these great festival. And Shirley, I'm so happy I got to be a part of something with you after all these years of trying, since the wonderful experience with you and everyone there. And I will keep trying every year until we can get me back there. But thanks for inviting me. Thanks to everybody, Emily, Miranda, Lindsay, everybody everybody that's helped out and setting it up and bearing with my last minute downloads and things. I was going to show some more clips, but I think it was better to talk, and these questions were really great. And I learned things from these questions, and it's always great talking about this stuff. And I'm on Facebook. If you have additional questions, find me, ask me. I'm here to help. And thanks everybody.